So welcome everyone. So I'm going to begin and welcome everybody to the second of our sessions in Phil's book club. This is the IMD book club at IMD. So I'm in Lausanne today. You wouldn't know it because the last time I had the same background, but I was somewhere else, but I happen to be in Switzerland. So welcome from IMD and thank you all for joining us. If you were with us last time, welcome back to the second month of Phil's book club. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to you as well. Welcome to everyone. Glad you're with us. Our goal in this is to create a community where we'll be reading books, sharing ideas. So I'm just going to begin. What we're going to do today is we're going to spend a little bit of time doing an introduction. Again, some of the principles that will guide us in the club, what this club is going to be about, what I expect, what I hope you can expect, and how we're going to operate. Some of you who were with us last month, maybe this is a bit of review, but I think for many people, this will be quite useful. So we'll do that. And then we're going to talk about this month's book. So we're very pleased to have this book called Invisible Women. And so we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about it differently this month than we might in other months, because in most months, my hope is that we're going to have a good online discussion forum open for several days, 3 days maybe, before this webinar. And by the time we come around to this webinar, you will have had a chance to discuss with one another your comments. I will be able to see those. And by the time we get to this webinar, which will always be on a Thursday, I'll have a lot of your thoughts and we'll have really an integrative discussion. For various reasons, we haven't been able to achieve that yet for the month of May. We're a little bit behind where we'd wanted to be, but we will be there soon. So this month, you're going to hear a bit more of my comments. And there will be one or two moments where I will ask a question. And by using the chat function, I would like as much as possible to get some of your thoughts, but it won't work quite as well this month. However, we have now opened the discussion forum that we will leave open for several days after today's webinar, because this is a book where, believe me, you don't just want to hear what I have to say. I think we all want to hear what one another has to say. This is a book that has to do with gender-based biases, and you don't want to listen to a man tell you about gender-based biases when many of you have your own experiences that I need to learn from and we all need to learn from. So we'll spend most of our time talking about today's book, and then I'll set up where we're going from here. And I'm expecting, I think on average, these will run about 45 minutes. So, fasten your seatbelts, and that's how we'll spend the next bit of time. I do want, however, since this is only the second month of our book club, to spend a bit of time reviewing what our aims are. The aim here is to be able, quite apart from everything you're doing, reading daily newspapers and watching webinars and podcasts and all these other things that go on, our aim is to create a community where we talk about books in some depth. These are not going to be business books per se. So I'm not going to tell you, well, here's a great book about marketing or about finance or something. But these are books that I and my colleagues think are very good general books for a managerial audience, probably that take us one step out of the business world and look at the broader context. So we're going to look at books on topics that provide the framing and the context in which managers operate in fields like economics, technology, psychology. Today's about gender and data. The next one about geopolitics. That's what we're going to be doing. And the three books that we're beginning with, I picked intentionally to try to communicate the range and the tone of the books. So the first book we did last month was Robert Iger's book called The Ride of a Lifetime. This is a personal account by one executive in one industry, and it has its strengths, but it's that kind of book. Today we have a totally different book. It's not about one person. It's about half the population of the world. It's not about one company. There are examples from a few companies, but it's really not about companies or profitability of a company. It's much broader than that, and much is about daily life, about politics, about society. And then next month, we're going to look at the geopolitical side with a book called The Future is Asian, and I'll tell you about that as we wrap up. What we're going to be doing, and again, this is a slide from last time, but as we're just starting off, I wanted to emphasize this. We're going to look at books in the following way. First of all, we're going to look at books with respect. We're only picking one a month. So any book that is maybe questionable or doubtful in some way, we're not going to talk about it in this club. I'm going to bring you books that I think are worth your time and effort. And because of that, we're going to read them thoughtfully and respectfully. Smart people spend a lot of time putting these books together. We're going to pay them the courtesy and the respect of reading what they've done with that same tone. We're also going to read with great curiosity. What can we learn from this book? The point of reading a book is not just to get to the end, it's to say, what had I not thought of? How does this change the way I understand things? What value can we derive from it? What are lessons we can learn? What actions can we take? And the third thing we're going to do is we're going to approach all the books with a critical mindset. Critical does not mean negative. It doesn't mean finding fault. It just says, let's not believe everything we're told. Let's use our independent judgment and make up our own mind. And we will do that today as well, to some extent. I think generally today, I at least am in a listening and learning mode, but there's one or two points where I'm going to be a little bit critical as well. This is the basic schedule as we intend it. We're not quite there yet in delivery, but we're getting close. There's one book picked for each month, and I've announced 3. I then announced the book for the following month, for July. We'll talk about that. And for every month, this is the teacher in me, I'm going to give you 3 questions to reflect on as you read. 3 questions in terms of preparation. The plan is that for the week, which is normally the 3rd week of the month, this week we slipped it to the 4th, but we'll probably go back to the 3rd week of the month. We'll begin on the Monday of that 3rd week by opening an online discussion forum, and there will be 3 parallel discussion streams for these 3 questions. So the question will be repeated, and somebody will say, well, here's what I thought. And somebody can say, yeah, that's a good point. What about this? And somebody else can say, not sure about that. But this allows us to have an asynchronous discussion on these 3 points, which is really important for a couple reasons. One is, there's no way in these 45 minutes I can absorb, digest, and manage all of your thoughts, nor should you have to limit your participation to these 45 minutes. So by having the discussion forum, we achieve that. The other thing is we've got folks, we hope, on this forum who are on this club who are going to be all around the world in many different time zones. So I'm going to do this twice today, but in the future, maybe it'll just be once for the live webinar, but the asynchronous will have much more opportunity for you to contribute at the time that makes sense for you. After those 3 days, then we'll have this session. And that'll be the live webinar at the end. And then when this is over, within a couple days, a written review, which reflects my comments, but also I hope takes on board some of what you've provided, either online or in this live session, will be reflected as well. So that's the idea. You heard me say this last month, if you were with us last month, but I think as we're just getting the club off the ground, and it's still in very early stages, this is what you can expect. What about your participation? Well, you can participate at a number of different levels. And believe me, we want to make this as welcoming and as supportive of you and your time and your needs as possible. So the ideal might be that, well, you know what the books are a few months in advance, you find them, you read them, you participate actively, that's great. But that's not going to be the case for everybody, and certainly not every month. So there are some times you might say, oh, this is a month when I'd really like to read it and participate very actively. Other months, I'll just see I'll read the written review, or I'll tune in, or I'll watch the video at a time that suits me, because we will make these available, posted in a way that you can read later. Some of you might say, I'm just going to follow the discussion, read the summary. That's really all I need. And the answer I would tell you is any of those is fine. We do think that having a book a month is a very nice supplement to your normal intake of information. So that's the main idea. Okay, let's move ahead. That's by way of introduction. And I hope to see you in future weeks as well. They're also on the IMD website. There are places where you can submit your comments, make suggestions, anything that you want to give as general comments about the book club, you can do that as well. But let's move on, because I'd like to spend more of our time now talking about this book, Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. The author is Caroline Criado Perez. And I'm going to begin with a few of my comments. In fact, before I talk about this book, I'm going to say something a little bit different, which is how I like to start our talk about any books and how I encourage you to approach books. Anytime you pick up a book, the first question you might ask is, well, what kind of book is this? Is this science? Is it an argument? Is it a narrative? What's it about and how should we think of it? What's it trying to do? And therefore, by what standards should we evaluate it? And this is a very important point because we sometimes criticize books for totally wrong reasons. And I can tell you this as an author. I've written books and people say, well, you did this, but you really didn't do that. It's like, yeah, I didn't want to do that. That's a different book. This book is about this. It's not about that. So how we evaluate a book, I think, should be based on the intentions and the stated goals of the author. As well, no book can be everything to everybody. As an author, you make choices. What belongs in the book, what goes somewhere else, how you arrange things in terms of logic, how deep you go, how broad you go. And I think in all of this, we want to hold a book accountable for what it seeks to do, not for something else. And I'll come back to that at the end, because I got to the end of this book and I thought, oh, I'd like to know more about this and this. Well, is that a fault of the author that she didn't address those things? I think not, actually. I think it's a strength of the author that I ended the book with questions that lead me to want to read more from some other author who says, that's what I'm going to write about. But let me now spend a moment about our first two books. Remember, the first three are communicating something about the range. But how do we think about these books? So the first book we looked at last month was Robert Iger's book, The Ride of a Lifetime. And this is the cover. Well, covers tell you a lot. What does this cover tell you? There's Robert Iger. This is going to be a book about Robert Iger. And sure enough, it's a personal story about his ride and his lifetime and what he learned. He's an incumbent CEO. It's his experiences, his insights. He's on the cover. And when you look at the pictures, there's him with this famous person, that famous person. And I'm an academic. I look at the end of the book and I realize there's no endnotes, there's no references, there's no citations, there's no bibliography. If I want to know where did he get that information, I have no idea. And you know what? That's okay for the book he wanted to write, because it was a personal memoir of his career. This book is totally different. So look at the cover of this book. There's no photograph of the author here. In fact, you really have to dig to learn anything about the author, because this is not Caroline Criado Perez saying, look at me. She's saying, let's look at this phenomenon. And in fact, it's a wonderful cover, Invisible Women. I have this version. I think this is the UK paperback. The one there might be the US hardback. The title differs a little, but it's a wonderful title because you have these very dark images of men, black, bold, and they pop out at you. And then you really have to look to see that between these male figures are female figures that are not very visible. And it's a very nice book in that regard. But this is a book that says, and the subtitle says, it is to expose data bias in a world designed for men. That's the thesis. And that's what we want to hold her accountable for. Has she demonstrated that? Is there data bias? What evidence do we have of that the world has been often designed for men? And in her early on, she says, I will show, I will argue, I will demonstrate. That's her claim. So she is marshaling data to make a point. And it's not about the author, but is this one endnoted and cited and referenced? Absolutely. My little book here had about 70 pages of endnotes. Why is this important? What she's saying is, I'm not making this up. And if you want to look at where I got data, you can go do that. And once or twice I did, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. So let's move on. First of all, a personal disclaimer. gosh, this is a book about gender bias, and you've got somebody who's quite obviously male, right down to my little white goatee. Who am I to be telling you about gender bias? Well, I did contact a colleague of mine, a female, and I said, maybe we should do this one together. And could you be a guest voice? And first, yes. And then, well, for scheduling reasons, didn't happen. So that's okay. But I just want you to know I'm going to do my best reviewing it. But one of the things we know about bias is we're often not aware of our own biases. So you should also be asking yourself this question, not just about the book, but about the person who's reviewing the book. Are there things I'm missing? Are there biases I may have? So you may want to comment on that. And I would welcome that in the discussion forum. We won't really have a chance live over the next half hour or so, but you might say, well, interesting, this is what occurred to Phil, but here's how I see it. In fact, I think of all the books we're going to look at, the one that I really wanted to have the broad discussion forum online was this one. So I'm sorry that we haven't had it before today, but we will have it after. All right, so I will give you some of my comments, but then to the extent we can on chat, I'd like to get some comments from you, but most importantly, we will tell you, we will write to you when this is done with the link of how to go on our site and to use the forums. I was told just a few moments ago that it has been opened as of last night, but a little late for today, but we want to get these from you. All right, let me give you some of my thoughts about this book. And again, I'm using my critical judgment about the book. You can use your critical judgment about me and figure out if I've missed something as well. I would tell you, I thought this was a fabulous book. It's really an outstanding book. If you are intrigued after today's session, please go out and get it, pass it along. I think it's a very important book. I think it's a revealing book. I was going to say it's a timely book, but actually it's a book that is a timeless book. It's, I think, always been relevant. Maybe we are finally coming to the point as a society or as a civilization where enough people are interested in this topic. So it's timely in that regard, but the message is not a time-limited message. It's very, very broad. In my view, does this book achieve its aims? Absolutely. It is exposing gender bias, and it does it, I think, brilliantly in more ways than you can imagine, in more places. And to me, one of the real strengths of this book is that as you go through it, you say, oh, I was aware of this. And yeah, I guess I was aware of that. And then you say, gosh, I had no idea about this. And I didn't really see that either. So in my view, it was really powerful in that regard. And I would tell you it did two things really, really well. And as an author, I admire this. Number one, it is broad and deep to a sufficient degree. You can always be deeper, you can always be broader, but those things tend to trade off. And at some point, if it's broad and deep, it becomes unreadable because it's too big. So there's choices that were made that I thought were terrific. There's a wide range of topics. I'll talk about them in a moment, with many examples. And what comes across here is she's not simply finding isolated examples that are interesting on their own, but they fit together in a pattern. There's a story that's being told here about exactly what the title says, a systematic bias in data based on this notion of things having been implicitly for men. So I admired that. The other thing I liked very much about this book is the tone. It's brisk, it's energetic, but more than that, there's a tone of moral outrage here. This is somebody who says we should all be fed up about this. This is not right, and it is entirely proper to be impatient and angry about what is clearly inequitable and unfair. Yet, at the same time it does that very well, it is grounded in data. So I wrote here, it is passionate and it is dispassionate. Because if it was only passionate, you'd say, oh, here's somebody getting all excited, and if it was all cold and scientific, you might think, well, so what? But it really does both of those very well. So I give this book very high marks, and I think it's of extremely high value to many different audiences. So I'm male, and I'm reading the book, and I'm thinking, wow, this is really valuable for men to read. And then you stop and say, what are women thinking when they're reading this? So let me tell you my guess, and you can tell me if I'm even close. I may not be. I think my guess is for women, part of what this book does is it validates. You've very likely experienced some of these things in very acute ways. And what it says is, you're right. What you have experienced here and here is part of this broader whole. And so it is, I think, supportive of women. I think it's very empowering of women. And I think it also is intended to embolden women and say, do not think that you should overlook this or this because they're isolated and exceptional. They are not. They are part of a broad picture that is systemic. And if one of the benefits of this book is to mobilize and embolden women, I think that's fabulous. For men, I think it also does something else. Many of the examples are revelatory. There are some where I thought, ooh, I never thought about that, but I think that's right. So it does a lot to raise awareness, and it also does a lot to confront, because any man reading this, myself included, has to say, gosh, is that the way I've looked at things? Am I guilty of that? Do I make that assumption? Do I say, well, of course, this has been, if it applies for men, it applies for women too, which is a lot of what she talks about, this notion of the default male. I also think it's very valuable, whatever your gender may be, for people who are managers, decision makers, policy makers, to ask the question, have we made decisions that are fair? Are there things we must redress and improve? So this is my one-page summary. I think it was really a terrific book. Let me move on now. A few central ideas. If you want to glean a few ideas from this, one I would say, and this was the title of her first chapter, she talks about the default male. Example after example of things that were designed or assumed to be maybe for everybody, but they were based on the idea that what works for men works everywhere. What addresses men's needs is suitable. And that's the default male. And it's a really important point she makes. And my guess is she did this very consciously, because she could have been much harsher and assumed something about commission, that men are deliberately making decisions to be harmful. Here and there, she does a little bit of that, but broadly, she talks about errors of omission. It's not that these malign or badly intended men are doing these things deliberately. It's just in their mind, they didn't bother to ask. They didn't make the effort. And so we have a problem of omission at least as much as commission. And one of the things that comes through very clearly is this notion that we just don't have the data, because we have not gathered what she calls sex disaggregated data. We haven't from the beginning asked questions to understand product needs, workplace rules, social policies, tax policies, all kinds of things in a way that addresses male and female issues. And the result of that, and again, this is this tone of outrage that you find over and over, is that what is appropriate for women is considered, in many cases, a niche. Oh, well, that's a niche need. That's a special need. Oh, that's a special case. The idea being implicitly that female needs or requirements or desires are a departure from the norm, and the norm, therefore, is implicitly male. So one thing this book does very well is it says, where do we start? What's our point of departure? Is our point of departure something we've designed implicitly for men, and then, oh, well, we're going to tailor that in a special way for women? Or do we truly begin with a neutral starting point and say, let's talk about human beings, roughly 50% male, 50% female. And so how do we think from a point of departure that addresses the needs of all human beings? And I thought it was very powerful in that regard. I'm not going to go part by part, but I just want to communicate here, if you haven't read the book, again, I talked about breadth and depth. One thing that is very broad here is she goes from some things that are kind of mundane, everyday life, things you encounter. She begins with snow clearing. She begins with access to public toilets, but a lot about the workplace, hours, job design, promotions, the idea of merit, even when we think we're gender neutral, we may not be. She talks about product design, products that might be designed for, I'm going like this, I'm opening a jar, strength, height, that again, implicitly male. Design things like zippers on clothing, all kinds of examples here. Part 4, there's a lot here, and again, a very strong tone of, I think, moral outrage. Healthcare, medicines that have been designed for male needs, how the male body might absorb medication, male skin, male body type compared to women, not to mention everything to do with reproductive care. Public life gets into issues around taxation and how we count income. And again, strong tone of moral outrage here, but that so much of the unpaid work that is done in the world is done by women, not counted as a job, not paid, not benefits attached. And so much there, how governments, policies, what they gather, what they don't, maybe it's omission, but still has the effect of disadvantaging women in systematic ways. And the last part there, when things go wrong, this is a chapter about calamities, famines, civil war, crime, all kinds of situations where women are disproportionately looking after children, looking after the elderly, and disadvantaged, and so forth. So this is a run through the book. It's a terrific book, again, broad as well as deep. I'm just going to mention a couple things that occurred to me. And I'm missing a little bit some of your comments. There'll be a moment where I ask you a little bit, but we probably won't have too much time for that. But I encourage you to go to the forums because I'd like you to have the chance to, at your leisure, contribute some of your thoughts. As I read a lot of these examples of data bias, I was asking myself, well, is there one kind of data bias? Are there a few kinds of data bias? And I had the idea that there were at least 3 kinds. And she doesn't make this categorization. This is my categorization. Maybe you agree with it, maybe you don't. Maybe you find it helpful, maybe you don't. But she would kind of move back and forth between them. I think there's a certain value in being a bit systematic here. So I found the following. One is there were some examples where the data themselves are not biased. The data are fine, but the interpretation of the data is based on certain assumptions that are laden with gender notions. So, for example, very early on, there's this chapter about snow clearing. I think it's in Sweden. Well, and the idea there is when the snow falls and when transportation is disrupted, where do we first try to make sure that we clear the snow? Well, snow is snow. There's not a lot of gender there. And when you look at patterns of traffic, well, the data are the data. It's not the data that were problematic. It's when we then make decisions about what to prioritize. What she describes is the priority was given to, well, we've got to plow the streets so that passenger cars can get to work. The idea there being that the default male idea being that individuals get in their cars, drive their cars to their place of employment, do their job, and come home. Seems very important, seems very natural to men. What she points out is that public transportation is disproportionately used by probably lower income, but oftentimes women who are not doing point-to-point and return travel, but maybe dropping off children at school, doing shopping, and a job, and taking elderly parents to see the doctor. And so caring about individual cars going to work and back didn't intend to be, but it had a gender knock-on effect because that's not a gender-neutral transportation pattern. So there are many examples in the book where the problem is not the data. The problem is the interpretation of the data. However, I think there are even more examples where the problem is the data themselves. And oftentimes the data are biased because we don't have the data in a sex disaggregated way. Why? Because we haven't collected it. Why? Because nobody thought to collect it. And more often than not, it was a man who didn't think to collect it. And so by beginning with this notion of the default male, which again, nobody says, oh, I'm going to look at the world as if it's only made of men, but you have certain assumptions. It shapes the data that you think to gather, the data that you don't think to gather, with the resulting problems in those 6 parts about whether it's medicine or whether it's workplace design or whether it's product design and so forth. And then there was even a third category. And to me, this was one of the most, I think it was the one that really made me stop and think. Because one of the points she makes is that even when we think we are being gender neutral and make an effort to be gender neutral, the impact of our decisions may still have a disproportionate impact on males and females. And I give a couple of examples of that in a moment. I'll just mention one. It had to do, again, so I've been a lifelong academic, and there's one point where she talks about giving a little extra time, space, support for mothers as they have to prepare their research for some tenure decision. Well, as soon as you say that, a well-meaning person says, oh, but it's not just women, it's young parents of all, male and female. Fine. So what a number of universities have done in the name of gender neutrality is to say, we're going to make this additional time and support available for young parents. Sounds fair. But what Ms. Criado Perez argues is that, in fact, the needs are not equivalent. And so that policy, while it seems initially to be gender neutral, has a disproportionate benefit to men, whereas the women, the mothers, have certain obligations or take certain roles that usually go beyond what the men do. So that I thought was quite important as well. Let me just pause there for a minute. I asked you, or I made available, I didn't ask you, but I made available 3 questions to prepare. And I'm going to do this every month. I have 3 different questions next month. But the questions were these, of the examples of gender bias, which to you were most striking or surprising or memorable? And I wanted you to think about that. And we have a forum where I would very much love to see your answers there. And then number 2, from your personal or professional experience, what other examples of gender bias can you think of? What's the source, how serious the effect, and so forth? So you might say, well, there was great stuff in the book, and I learned a lot. That's point number 1. But in addition to that, hey, let me tell you something else I've seen, point number 2. So I would love to see you answer those as well as you can. And then number 3, it's not enough just to say, well, this is the nature of the issue. What can we do about it? What can you do about it? What can we do about it to take action? Because what comes through over and over is that this is not just unfair and inappropriate, but not good for all members of society, mothers, fathers, children, and so forth. So these are the questions I gave. And what I'd like to do now is just very briefly, we don't have time to do it exhaustively. I'd love to see you write at whatever length you want on the forum. But for these first 2 questions, I'll just take a moment. Let's just stick with the first. What to you, if you want to just write a note on the chat and we can all see it, and I'll take a moment out, what was an example that you found most striking, most surprising, more memorable? And let's just take a moment. I'd like to see what you write on this. And I'm seeing names like Federica, Victoria, Magda. I sure hope there's some men out there too. Where's Frederick and Victor? But I'm making a little joke there. So I'd be glad to look at this. So here's Anand. So this is a male. And yes, the snow clearing example, very good. And Magda's talking about the health effects, medicines, case of aspirin, what's been recommended for men as preventative care for heart disease. There's a lot here, and this is one I had known about, but there's a lot about how heart attacks, the classic symptoms of heart attacks, tingling, numbness, these kinds of things, those are based on lengthy studies of men. And the way that symptoms of heart disease and heart attacks present in females can be quite different. Mathieu describes access to for public toilets, and he says, as an architect, good providing equal spaces. This was another one. So thank you for that, Mathieu. This was another one where I thought it was fascinating because who can be against the principle of equal space and equal access? The problem is the needs are not equal. The amount of space required in a cubicle versus a urinal would be different. The frequency and duration of trips to a toilet will be different. And so by saying, well, we're going to have equal space, the result is not equal. And then there was this great example. Some well-meaning person somewhere, it was at a movie theater, said, here's what we do to avoid the long lines you see snaking out of the restrooms for the ladies. We'll say anybody can go anywhere, and that will alleviate this disparity. It made it worse because what it meant was women aren't going to go to the one that has the urinals, but men now felt that they could go, if they wanted, to the one with only the cubicles. Federica talks about the keyboards. Yeah, actually, I'm a male with fairly small hands. I would like that as well. And that's actually a point I would make. There's a continuum on both genders, but another point. Magda, fairness, equality. Van, examples relevant. So here we are. Van says, Van Zel, I'm reading, some of the examples were relevant, but some were fitted to provide the example while the same criterion could be applied to other segments. I think that's true. And I'll give you an example in a moment of a few places where I had the feeling there was a little bit of cherry picking going on. And it's an important question. Is this a book that is trying to address a scientific question and gathers data to see what the answer might be? Or is it a book that begins with an answer and then picks data to support? A little bit of that. Here, Terry says, I know this Terry, so Terry I know is a female, says, I had an argument with my architect to put a laundry room on the main floor, an area for kids to drop dirty clothes. Yes, thank you for that. I fully get that. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to encourage you to take these brilliant ideas, for which I'm very grateful, and we will direct you. I don't have the link in front of me, but we'll get it to you so you can write these on the discussion forums, because I'd really like to collect as many of these as I can. I'm mindful of time. We're certainly not going to go more than an hour. I'd like to go a little bit less, but thank you for these. Let's have more. Here were a few that I thought of. To me, these were the most striking ones for me, only because there were some things I thought, yeah, okay, I get that. And there were a few I thought, ooh, this is surprising. These are counterintuitive. The first one I comment on here is things that we think we intend to be gender neutral are actually not neutral. The other two I thought were really interesting were in chapter 7. The plow. Now, this is the English spelling, P-L-O-U-G-H, the American spelling, P-L-O-W. It's the same word. This is a labor-saving device in agriculture. Great. You would think, labor-saving device in agriculture, isn't that a good thing? Point she makes, to me this was not intuitive, is that moving from hand tools to plows actually was more advantageous for men as opposed to women. And there's even a suggestion of a study that suggests the introduction of plows had a harmful, I'm going to use that term, in quote marks, had a harmful effect on relative gender roles because it tended to advantage people with, greater upper body strength. That was surprising to me. There's another wonderful example in chapter 7. They talk about one of the problems in many developing worlds that where you use heating oil for cooking in a small kitchen is fumes, pollution, problems with lungs. And so a lot of NGOs and development organizations have said, let's come up with better cooking. Let's move away from the traditional oil and indoor cooking, and let's have these better sort of low emission stoves. They would introduce them and they would not be accepted. They would not be taken up. What's the problem here? And as the author says, the women were blamed. Well, what's wrong with them? They're not picking it up. Rather than understanding what is it about the nature of these stoves that makes them inappropriate or not really desirable. And one of the issues had to do with, because they're more sophisticated, they break down with greater frequency. And when they break down, you have to call for help. There may be nobody to help fix it, or the person that fixes it is a man. And so you're once again dependent on a man somewhere. So that I thought was a quite interesting point as well. I'm going to move on, but welcome your thoughts on this. Then there's this last question. How can we draw upon the insights to take action? And I would tell you, this is a book that begins by saying, I'm going to present you with the data, and I want you to look at the evidence. But very quickly in the introduction, she says, this, I'm quoting from her here, says, at heart, Invisible Women is a call to action. This is not a book that simply wants to open your eyes. It wants to open your eyes and say, based on that, what can we do? There are many moments at the end of many chapters where it says, well, we ought to have more of this and we need to have more of that. But it asks the question, what kind of action? Do we need just greater awareness or greater rules, regulations? I'm going to spend a moment, though, on reflecting here, because I reflected a bit, of course, on, what have I done that I think is gender neutral or is biased, or, where have I wittingly or not demonstrated, and I thought of two IMD examples. I know I have IMD colleagues here, so they're probably wondering what I'm going to say, but I had a couple. One that I will tell you from my experience as director of our EMBA program, we had a design for many, many years where the EMBA was a one-year program, and to be admitted to that, you had to have done a prerequisite, which was our program for executive development, which was 2 modules of 5 weeks residential, which meant you had to have been here on campus 2 times 5 weeks. Okay, you could do it this 5 weeks and then 6 months later another, but you had to be here for 10 weeks. When I got here many years ago, well, that's just what our program is about. And when we began to run the EMBA, we had a lot of people who had taken that program and could qualify. Over the years, and when I became director, our enrollment kept dropping for the EMBA. And I knew I was improving the program. So how is it that I'm improving the program, I'm getting fewer people? And the answer was, in this day and age, 2 times 5 weeks residential is discouraging a lot of applicants. So back in 2012, we changed things, and we completely changed the requirement to apply for the EMBA, where we reduced from 2 times 5 weeks to 1 module of 4 weeks and then something online. Immediately, enrollment came back, but more importantly, it came back with a very different gender mix. From about 10% female, it went to maybe 35% female. And we stopped and said, how did we not understand that the requirement for residential time at IMD was hugely disadvantaging the women in the segment we're looking at? Because what was the segment we were looking at? It's professionals between about 35 and 45. Well, hello, 35 to 45, you probably have young children at home, and it was much easier for a man to go off to IMD for 10 weeks, knowing that the children and the family was being looked after by the mother, than the reverse. So that to me was a big aha. And you stop and say, how did we not understand that? But we didn't. So that's again where I would say you really need to begin by saying, let's not make assumptions that are a default male assumption and then think of, oh, how do we now adapt for women? We need to start at the beginning by saying, we're looking for executives in this demographic, male or female. How do we make that work? I put one more here, which is about the teaching experience and evaluations. I have heard this from female colleagues of mine over the years, that the very nature of leading a discussion in a room of 60 people, most of whom are male, can be a more difficult thing for a woman to do. It has to do partly with stature, with voice, with the roles that we imagine, the behaviors that we imagine to be easily or appropriately handled by men and not. And then I put evaluations. I don't know this, but I've heard some of my female colleagues say that the very way that they are evaluated by participants also carries with it a certain gender bias. So I throw those out. And then acting. What do we do about all this? And I think broadly, if I look at the suggestions in the end of chapters, there are here and there mentions of, we need this policy, we need to have this requirement. But I also think raising awareness is a first step. And again, I want to hold the book accountable for what it says to do. It does not say solving the gender bias. It says exposing data bias. So I think it does that very well. And where we go from this is a slightly different conversation, which, if we're inspired to address, is thanks to a book like this. Now, I'm going to be a little bit critical about every book, and so I would be unfair if I wasn't somewhat critical on this one. Again, critical does not mean negative. It means addressing strengths, weaknesses, limitations, and so forth. And broadly, I think this is a fabulous book. Broad, deep, timely, relevant, tone is good, so I recommend it highly. It is worth asking the question that one of you, I think, mentioned, which is this a book that has a question and, in the spirit of science, gathers data to answer the question? Or is this a book that begins by saying, I have an argument to make, and I'm going to collect stories that make my case? It's the difference between scientific inquiry and argumentation. I think this book summons a lot of science, but very clearly in the spirit of argumentation. Not always a bad thing. I think there's, as I say, passion and dispassion. There were a few things that didn't sit quite right with me. There was one in chapter 10. I'm reading this, and it says here, I'm quoting, it says, a 2014 op-ed published in the journal Scientific American complained that including both sexes in experiments was a waste of resources. Well, I read that and I said, wait a minute. Scientific American, that's a very good, solid journal. I don't think they would have said it quite like that. But to her credit, she said, well, here's the endnote 42. I go to endnote 42. I look it up. And then I said, well, let me find that. So, I made a copy. This is it. Vive la différence. And what it says in the subtitle here is, it says, requiring medical researchers to test males and females in every experiment sounds reasonable, but is a bad idea. And what it goes on to say is that in many times, gender differences are relevant and should be included, but there are times when, because it's not the focus of the inquiry, in order to have two different samples, raises costs, makes, and therefore actually deprives us of the resources to look at other specifically gender-focused issues. It's actually a very good op-ed. And I come back to what she wrote. Was a race, including both sexes in experiment? It does not say that in some experiments. And that makes all the difference. When I read something like that, I think, it wouldn't have been harmful to be a little more precise. But it's an example of cutting a corner to make an argument. And in the very next paragraph, because now my antenna's out, in the very next paragraph, there's another statement that's a sweeping comment. And I went and I looked that one up, and the same thing. So my fear is that sometimes, for the purpose of argumentation and making a point, there's a little bit of cutting corners, but these are small quibbles and they do not detract from the broad point I want to make. It also made me want to look at further reading. And again, you never criticize a book for what it's not. In fact, if it makes you want to read more, that's probably a good thing. But there were two broad categories where I really wanted to know more when this book ended. One of them, while it is a very good expose of gender bias, it doesn't talk, I think, enough. Well, no, I'm not going to say not enough. It did what it wanted to do, but it made me want to know more about where these come from. Okay. And that takes us into the field of gender studies, and it's a massive field that I know very little about. But there are very clear differences in anatomy, physiology, and more that the author describes and is very happy to talk about. But how does these sex differences lead to gender differences? And by gender differences, we mean the social construction of roles and norms. The book is not saying there are no differences among men and women. It's also not saying because there are these differences, we should have all of these differences in roles, expectations, policies, and so forth, but how one connects to the other. And, I would like to know more about that. So it made me think a little bit of how did we get here? Where does all this come from? And related to that, I'll now shift it to another axis, which is I didn't get a lot in this book about differences around the world. Many of the examples are Western Europe, Anglo-Saxon speaking world. A lot of examples from North America, from Britain. She lives and works in Britain. Her education is there. From Australia, New Zealand, Scandinavia. Why? Probably because there's a lot of talk about these issues in those countries and a lot of science. But how pervasive these issues are in other parts of the world, there's at least anecdotal evidence. In some places, it's more severe. In some places, it's less severe. But I'd like to know a bit more about that. But these are really issues for further reading. I don't suggest these as criticisms. They're not deficiencies of this book, but they inspire further reading. That's where I want to end my review of this book. I've written up a bit of a review. I'd like to read as many of your comments as possible. I regret that we didn't have the online forum prior to today, but I believe it is open now. And after we're done, I'd like to ask the folks who have, I'm just seeing one comment from Magna. Don't you think she has a right? Absolutely. So I'm going to answer Magda's comment here. Does she have a legitimate right to be angry? I didn't see the anger, however. I saw the anger. So maybe I'm projecting myself on here. What I saw here, and I'm saying this to Magda and everybody, I sensed somebody who said, I feel this anger passionately, but if I express too much anger, I will be dismissed as an angry, strident, shrill woman. And nothing tends to disempower somebody more quickly than to be dismissed as angry, extreme, and shrill. I think she did a wonderful job of navigating passion and dispassion. So Magda says maybe another bias not allowed to show anger too much. I think that's exactly right. And I think the dilemma she faces, and again, maybe I'm projecting, maybe this is my biased interpretation, tell me I'm wrong. But I think it's how do I mobilize this anger in a way that is going to be productive rather than venting anger in a way that is actually going to undercut my argument. I think she did that very well. And I think she did that deliberately. As an author, this is something you think about. What is the tone? What is the voice? So I just say hats off to her for that. But I would love to see your comments. We're going to leave the forum open. I'm going to ask my colleagues here that produce this club to write to everybody who is registered and say, whether you were on the webinar with Phil today or not, fine, but please go to the site because we really want to get the richness of your comments and your thoughts, okay? A word about where we go from here. So I do hope to get more on this, and we will post a brief review that I've written, and I'm going to revise a bit with a colleague based on comments that we see. But we do hope that as of June, we will be able to adhere by what we've set out, which is that there will be an online forum, a thread for each question, and a live webinar. We'll communicate the date. I think we're going to move again to the third week of the month. So Terry says, please send the forum, please send a link to the forum. Yes, we will do that. I asked for it. I didn't get it in time to give to you here, but we will write to everybody who is registered and taking part because we'd love to get your thoughts. The next book we have is this one called The Future is Asian. And again, I'm sorry, I'm trained as a professor, so I'm going to give you study questions. You might read this book and say, well, those weren't the important study questions. There's other stuff. Fine, we want to hear from that. But I find it useful as I read a book to have some questions to stimulate my thinking, and these are the ones we have left to you. So please take a look at that. And then for July, we're going to go with this book. This is one of the best books I've written. I'm trained as an economist, going back to undergraduate days. This was a book by Mariana Mazzucato, also, I think, Italian by birth, lived a lot in North America, now professor in the UK. This is a wonderful book that really made me rethink a lot of what I had long accepted in the field of economics. And so I strongly recommend this to you as well. And very soon, we will announce the August book. And I think we're going to try to give you not quite beach reading, but the management equivalent of beach reading. So we're going to keep this up and hope this builds and look forward to your comments. I can tell you where we're going to go next will be these two books about General Electric, Lights Out and Hot Seat. Lights Out is an expose of everything that went wrong at General Electric, and Hot Seat, written by Jeff Immelt, who was the guy in charge, who's going to say, here's why I had such a tough job and why actually I didn't do so badly. I'm thinking we should do, well, if you're up for it, we could do it as 1 month because they really go together, and then we can move on to other things after that. But I think we'll do that. I'm going to suggest them both, and if you read one or the other, that'll be fine. But we'll announce that. That's August. June, we talk about the futurization. July, we'll talk about the value of everything. And with that, it's just about the end of the hour. I'm a bit regretful that I didn't have all your comments to be able to see your thoughts before this. So you ended up listening to a white man with a white beard tell you about a book that's about gender bias. Don't believe everything I say any more than you should believe anything anybody says. Take my comments as a stimulus. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't, but you certainly have your own life experience based on these topics that we'd love to see. So we will write to you soon with the information on the forum, and I hope you will go there and give us and all of your colleagues the benefits of your thought, and you will also benefit from the benefits of their thought. And I think with that, we'll wrap it up. This took me a little bit longer than I thought, but when you warm to a subject and you get going, this is what happens. So thank you all very much. Best wishes from IMD. I'm looking out the window and seeing our wonderful campus here, and we hope to see you here in the future. My next time with you, I'll probably be somewhere else, but the background will be the same. So thank you all very much. Look forward to your comments online and hopefully seeing you next month when we talk about the futurization. Thanks and goodbye.